Chapter 5, Can't Stop, Won't Stop. I walked to the driver's side window and demanded his wallet, at which time he smiled with a baneful sneer, drew a pistol, and fired one round into my chest. Boom! The sound reverberated again and again, echoing away in my unconscious mind. My own screaming woke me from my fitful sleep. Sitting up in the hospital bed, I struggled for clarity. Was it just a dream? I felt my chest for blood, a hole, anything that could prove or, for that matter, disprove my fearful thought of being shot again. I had been dreaming. Having a nightmare would be more accurate. But my dreams, or those I could recollect, have always been punctuated with gunfire. Gunfire directed at me, coming from me, or in my general vicinity. And never have I shrunk from the presence of such lethal violence. Being chased by Randy's huge donut is quite another matter, one to which I could not attach any sort of logic whatsoever. That scared me. For years, that damn donut chased me around in my dreams. I was so deathly afraid of those donut dreams that once I started banging, I often contemplated destroying the huge plastic replica on Normandy Century. Even today, I loathe the sight of it. My screams alerted the on-duty nurse, not to mention scaring the daylights out of my roommate, who was a gunshot victim too. In minutes, I was being attended by a nice-looking Chicano nurse who, as it turned out, had seen such post-shooting behavior many times. She explained that it was quite normal and expected. My main concern at first was to make sure I had been just dreaming, and then my pride stepped in and I inquired about the tone and sound of my screaming. Was I really screaming? Or was I just shouting? Was it loud or what? Against my worst fears of damaged masculinity, or what I perceived to be such, she confirmed that yes, it was a scream and it was very loud. Perhaps she felt she had been too literal for my young ego, as I'm certain she had seen me slump into a mournfully sagging posture. She fell heavily into a spill about my nightmares being normal, natural, and a result of the terrifying experience I had been through. All that was fine and sounded good, but could she please go down to South Central and explain that to my homies? Or better yet, my enemies, who would just love to hear of me having nightmares? This line of thinking caused me for the first time to question my roommate's origins and set affiliation. For if he belonged to the wrong set, this could be very harmful to my reputation and perhaps make it all the more difficult to continue my ascent through the ranks. Monster Kody having nightmares? Unthinkable. Shortly after the nurse's departure and before the morphine she administered took me under, I questioned my roommate. He was a hapless civilian, fresh out of the backwoods of a small town in Georgia, whose people lived in a highly active part of Los Angeles. He had been sprayed with buckshot from a passing vehicle. The possibility that he was a civilian had never crossed my mind, perhaps because I always tried not to shoot civilians, unless of course the bangers outnumbered them in a gathering. Should we get some flack for that later on? We could always claim association. We were hard driven for results, for confirmed body counts of combatants. From what my roommate said, he was simply standing in the front yard when a passing car unloaded some buckshot into him. After he told me this and his immediate plans to depart for back home, he repeated over and over in a strong southern drawl, "Damn this thing, damn this thing." He was totally taken aback by LA's madness, but to me it all seemed quite normal. Normal like the nurse had explained my nightmares were normal. It was normal for me to retaliate against anybody as a result of the terrifying experience I had been through, just like the nurse had explained. Of course, I twisted her explanation of my psychosis into a perverted alibi for my continued behavior. I rationalized my actions continually, and with each successive level of consciousness I reached, my rationalization became less convincing to me. Questions were often left to hang in the balance because my conscience simply refused to process them due to such illogical reasoning. So I'd avoided questioning myself about my ongoing radical behavior. I deadened my conscience with PCP, alcohol, and friends who they themselves had done likewise. I dozed off under the soothing waves of the morphine, wondering how it must be to live life like a civilian. I just couldn't imagine living the life of a hook. Those seemingly spineless nerds who were always victims of someone's ridicule or physical violence, who never responded to an affront of any type. I had, while in primary school, been victimized by cats during their ascent to king of the school. My milk money was taken. my lips were busted 2 or 3 times. Not because I decided to defend my dime or my honor, but because my assailant simply whacked me. Early on, I saw and felt both sides of the game being played where I lived. It was during my time in elementary school that I chose not to never be a victim again if I could help it. There was no gray area, no middle ground. You banged or held strong association with the gang, or else you were a victim, period. To stress this, when we made appearances at high schools, we'd often jump on hooks and take their money, leather jackets, hats, and such. What's contradictory here, and is one of the irrational questions I battled in my later years, is why are hooks victims of our physical wrath but unfair game and our lethal violence? The answer seemed to be that hooks seldom, if ever, shoot back. Other bangers, whom I convinced, like me, have been victimized at some point in their lives, had refused to let it continue, respond with the same violence they receive, if not something more lethal. Because of this, they must be smashed. Hooks are easy pickings for most anyone, but bangers know there is no glory in killing a hook. In fact, it's frowned upon in most areas. To me, however, to be unconnected meant to be a victim, and I couldn't imagine that. The next time I surfaced from my morphine-induced drip, I was in tremendous pain. Everywhere all at once, pain pounced on me with mind-racking weight. My stomach, which had been surgically cut open to remove some shredded intestines, was now closed with sutures and staples. Since the surgery was so recent, the cut skin had not yet started to heal, and in between the staples, the openings looked pus-filled. The sutures were so tight that I could barely move without feeling tied down. My stomach resembled railroad tracks that in some areas had been blown apart by saboteurs. The sight of this alone caused lumps in my throat. To the left and slightly below my navel was where the bullet had entered. There was just a hole there, uncovered and open. I could see pink inside. My pain in this area came from under my navel and around the staples. The tube in my nose, which ran down into my stomach, was attached to a pump-like machine next to my bed. Looking at it caused pain. It was extracting green slime from my stomach and storing it in a clear jar. The nurse called it poison. I couldn't comprehend that and just assumed I had been hit with poison bullets. The catheter in my maleness ran from under the covers over the side of the bed into what I don't know. I never looked. This was also very painful. My left hand had been broken by the impact of the second shot and was in a cast. It too throbbed with pain. I had taken 3 hits in the left leg, 2 side by side in the medius part of my front thigh, and one up a bit higher near my hip, almost on my butt. Like my stomach wound, these 2 had been left open and exposed. I had been hit in the upper back. I assumed this hole was also left open. From every hole or its surrounding area, I had pain. Looking from my stomach to the catheter to the open wounds and then to the pumping machine, I just couldn't put it all together. My thoughts ran at lightning speed in an attempt to answer some of the questions now being submitted for clarification. I was seriously dehydrated. My lips were cracked and dry. I reached out for the nurse's aid button hanging next to my bed, but my stomach pain was so intense I fell back in a heap. Frustration rose up like an evil serpent from a murky river, snatched me and drew me under. It was then that I began to realize the impact of me being wounded and all the mental strain that I had actually been under. I lay prone for what seemed like a day or two, trying to piece together what had taken place in my life over the past 5 years. Damn, it had actually been 5 years. Yes, 5 years had elapsed since my joining with the sect. Although it seemed like a long time, it had gone very quickly. At the same time, the seriousness of my chosen path had made me age with double rapidity. At 16, I felt 24. Life meant very little to me. I felt my purpose on earth was to bang. My mindset was narrowed by the conditions and circumstances prevailing around me. Certainly, I had little respect for life when practically all my life I had seen people assaulted, maimed, and blown away at very young ages, and no one seemed to care. I recognized early on that where I lived, we grew up and died in dog years. Actually, some dogs outlived us. Where I lived, stepping on someone's shoe was a capital offense punishable by death. This was not just a few isolated instances. Or as a result of 1 or 2 hotheads, but a recognized given for the crime of disrespect. Regardless of the condition of the shoes, the underlying factor that usually got you killed was the principle. The principle is respect, a linchpin critical to relations between all people, but magnified by 30 in the ghettos and slums across America. I had no idea of peace and tranquility. From my earliest recollections, there had been struggle, strife, and the ubiquity of violence. This ranged from the economic destitution of my family to the domestic violence between my parents, from the raging gang wars to the omnipresent occupational police force in hot pursuit. Peace to me was a fleeting illusion, only to be seen on TV programs like the Brady Bunch. I've never been at peace, and nothing has ever been stable. Everything in my life has been subject to drastic change or subtle movement, without so much as a hint of forewarning. I've always felt like a temporary guest everywhere I've been, all my life, and truly, I've never been comfortable. Motion has been my closest companion, from room to room, house to house, street to street, neighborhood to neighborhood, school to school, jail to jail, cell to cell, from one man-made hell to another. So I didn't care one way or another about living or dying.